Biyolojik komplekslik Tanrı'nın varlığı için delil midir? İndirgenemez komplekslik, alemin bir akıllı tasarımcı tarafından tasarlandığına delil midir?
What is the argument from biological complexity? How is irreducible complexity a sign for creation by intelligence?
Okay, I recently wrote a chapter about the question about how irreducible complexity is a sign of intelligence. And it occurs in this book called Contemporary Arguments in Natural Theology. And my argument is in chapter 5, entitled The Argument from Biological Complexity. And here's kind of a summary of the argument here. I know you can't read this, but I'm going to go through these steps. Most of the steps. I can't go through all of them in the limited amount of time. But for those who are interested, I've also written 3 books on the topic, starting with Darwin's Black Box 25 years ago, and several more, and one more recently in 2019. And the bottom line that all the books address is that Darwin's mechanism of evolution is entirely inadequate to explain the molecular structures of life. And I'll explain that as we go along. But first, let me start with the first point of my argument from that chapter in the recent book, and it's the most important one. And that is that we know from experience that intelligent beings can have purposes. Nothing else can have a purpose. And to achieve a purpose, an intelligent being can choose to arrange whatever is within their power to manipulate. Therefore, as a result, the action of an intelligent being can be detected by perceiving a purposeful arrangement of parts. Now that sounds like a lot of words, but here's an example to try to drive home the point. Here's a cartoon, one of my favorite cartoons, which shows several jungle explorers just walking along in a jungle, and the lead explorer has been strung up and skewered with some spikes. And this fellow turns to this guy and says, "That's why I never walk in front." Okay, I can sympathize with that. But everybody who sees this cartoon immediately realizes that this was designed. This is a trap. This is not an accidental arrangement of parts. As a matter of fact, the very humor of the cartoon depends on the reader recognizing the design of the trap. How do you do that? How do you know it was designed? You know it's designed because you see a number of parts that have been arranged for a purpose, the purposeful arrangement of parts. It turns out that that is the way, and the only way, that we can recognize the work of a mind. We can't read minds, we can only see what minds do. And so we recognize the work of a mind when we see purpose in an arrangement of parts. Okay, that's pretty much the dictionary definition of design, the purposeful or inventive arrangement of parts or details, or in brief, the purposeful arrangement of parts. And we infer design whenever we see that parts have been arranged for a purpose. But there are 2 other things you have to keep in mind so you don't get confused. And the first is that the strength of the design inference is quantitative. That means that the more parts we have and the more closely they fit their purpose, the stronger is our conclusion of design. And here's an example of that. Here's a picture of some mountains in Idaho in the United States, and you look at those and you don't think much of them. But here's a picture of some other mountains in the United States in New Hampshire. And if you look at it, this kind of looks like a face, doesn't it? It looks like there's a forehead, maybe a nose here, and a chin, and maybe an ear. And you wonder, maybe did some people in the distant past maybe arranged? And you say, no, it's just an accidental arrangement of rocks. But then if you go to this mountain in the United States, in South Dakota, this is called Mount Rushmore, and it's got the faces of 4 past presidents of the United States. And anybody who sees this, even if you've never heard of it before, immediately recognizes that this was purposely made. And that's because you can see all the parts that are put together for the purpose of portraying the images of the presidents. So the point is that a conclusion of design is quantitative. The more evidence we have, the stronger is our conclusion. Another thing you have to keep in mind when you think about intelligent design is that design can be found at multiple independent levels. It doesn't just occur at one level. You can have it at one level and another and another. And here's an example of that. If you go to a store, you can find building materials like lumber and cylinder or concrete blocks and so on. And you can tell that these are designed because they are shaped to fit their purpose of being building materials. But then those materials themselves can be arranged into another structure. And you can tell that this was designed too, and that the design is even beyond what the building materials were. And then when you see a finished house, you can recognize an even higher level of design. So the point is that we recognize different levels of design. Now, I'm a biochemist, a professor of biochemistry at Lehigh University in the United States, and biochemistry studies the molecules of life. And it turns out that those are the machines that the cell uses to do its everyday tasks. And one of the points in my argument is that the molecular basis of life consists of inanimate molecules. Molecules aren't living, they're inanimate molecules. But in living beings, these molecules are often found combined in extraordinarily complex, purposeful arrangements. And I go over a lot of those in the books that I showed earlier, but here's just one example. This is a model or a drawing of the structure of a molecular machine that is found in almost all cells called ATP synthase. And it is responsible for taking energy and packaging it into battery-like compounds called ATP, which all cells use to power their functions. And it's extraordinarily complex. It's a turbine engine where you have a rotary motor which pushes against another rotary motor, and the energy compresses chemicals together to form these batteries. And this is a much more complex machine than many that human beings have been able to make. So my point is that with just this one example, we can see that that life, even at the foundational level of molecules and cells, has extraordinarily purposeful arrangements. The next point of my argument in the chapter in the recent book is this, that claims of marvelous abilities for Darwinian processes notwithstanding, we know of no unintelligent process that, when examined in sufficient detail, mimics the ability of intelligence to arrange parts for a purpose. In other words, Darwinian claims for Darwinian evolution are vastly overstated, and that they cannot account for what has been discovered by science at the molecular level of life. And there are two major reasons for the problems with Darwin, for Darwin's theory. The first is something I call irreducible complexity, and that is that many machines, even simple machines such as a mousetrap, as we see here, are composed of multiple parts, and they need all of the parts to work. For example, this has a wooden platform and a spring and a holding bar and this other metal part called a hammer. And if you take away any of these pieces, the machine doesn't work. So it cannot be built slowly in tiny steps in a gradual fashion, as Darwin required for his theory. It turns out that the molecular machinery that has been discovered in the cell, like all machines, is composed of many different parts. For example, here's a machine called the bacterial flagellum, which is literally an outboard motor that some cells use to swim. It's got a long tail that acts as a propeller. It's got a region called the hook, which attaches the propeller to the drive shaft. The drive shaft is attached to a motor. The motor is clamped onto the cell membrane by a stator. There are bushing materials to allow the drive shaft to poke up through the membrane. And again, like a mousetrap, if these parts were missing, the motor wouldn't work. And so it cannot be built gradually as Darwin envisioned. That's problem number one. Problem number two is oh, I'm sorry. Here's one thing I forgot, that irreducibly complex systems have double significance. First of all, they are obstacles to Darwinism because they can't be produced gradually as his theory requires. And they are also evidence of purposeful design because they have multiple parts that are put together for a purpose. So they're double problems for Darwinism. Another problem with Darwinism has come to light recently, and that's the fact, and that was shown by experiments by this man, Richard Lenski, who grew bacteria in his laboratory for over 50,000 generations and looked to see how they would grow faster, how they would improve, how they would evolve. And here's a table from a recent paper 5 or 6 years ago in Nature showing the mutations in the genes that helped bacteria grow faster in his laboratory. And you can't see here, but it turns out that all of the mutations in all of the genes either broke the pre-existing gene or degraded the pre-existing gene. So they broke things that were already there. They did not make anything new. They did not build anything, let alone complex molecular machines. And if you think about it, it turns out degradation is one quick way to help adapt to a situation. Suppose you had this real nice car on the left, but suppose somebody said your life depends on your car getting better gas mileage. How could you quickly change your car so that it would get better gas mileage? Well, one thing you could do is throw away the doors and throw away the hood of the car or the trunk and strip it down so it weighed less. You know, that doesn't look as nice, and but nonetheless, if your life depended on your car getting better gas mileage, it would be best to throw things away. And it turns out that's an easy way to adapt an organism. And recent genomic studies have shown that many of the genetic changes underlying adaptation in dog breeds, as a matter of fact, the overwhelming number of them are ones that break pre-existing genes. If you want a dog with short legs, you can break the gene that makes sure that the legs grow to the proper length. If you want to have a dog like a bulldog with a short muzzle, you can break a gene involved in facial development. If you want a dog with long hair, you can break the control region that tells the hair when to stop growing. So you can make all sorts of changes, not by building new things, but by breaking things that were already there. And that's interesting, but this is not the kind of process that would build complex machinery in the first place. Other work has shown that the evolution of grizzly bear or polar bears from grizzly bears was accomplished mostly by breaking genes that were already there. Even mastodons, which descend from a common ancestor with elephants, 100 genes are broken in the mastodon versus the elephant. And this is work that's just come to light recently because of developments in our ability to sequence DNA. So people might say, well, why break genes? Why not make something new? Because it's a lot faster and a lot easier to break a gene than it is to make a new one. Genes are long, complex entities themselves, and in order to improve a gene, you might be able to change it in one or two places, but probably not anywhere else. But in order to break a gene, you can change it in many different places, and it no longer works. It's like taking a hammer and saying, if I hit my computer, where can I hit my computer with a hammer to improve it versus where can I hit it to break it? There's many ways or many places that would break the computer, many more than would help it function better. So here's a little cartoon or a little picture that shows how Darwinian evolution actually works. And these are policemen in a country that they got a report of some drug traffickers up the road, and they sent some police to raid the drug trafficking compound. But the drug traffickers heard about the impending police raid, and they blew up the only bridge that led to their compound. Now, from the point of view of the drug traffickers, this is a helpful change. This will stop the invaders from getting to them. So it's beneficial in a Darwinian sense. But blowing up a bridge does not show you how a bridge can be built. And it turns out that many mutations that are selected in a Darwinian fashion blow up genes, and that's helpful, but it doesn't tell us how genes are built in the first place. So the final point of my argument from that chapter is that we are justified in believing that an intelligent being acting either proximally or remotely designed the very foundation of life, the molecular and cellular foundation of life, because we see the purposeful arrangement of parts in the fantastically complex biological machinery of the cell, and we see that nothing else can account for it. And let me just remind viewers that the only way that we detect the work of a mind is through the purposeful arrangement of parts. And thanks to the very progress of science, we have discovered more and more purpose as science digs deeper into life.